This is a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Hello and welcome to the US-China Trade War Update. I'm Finbarr Bermingham on the Political Economy Desk at the South China Morning Post. It's a new year, it's a new decade, and if it keeps up like this, 2019 will feel like a walk in the park. The US and Iran are firing rockets at each other, Australia is burning, and we have an unknown SARS-like virus spreading in Hong Kong and mainland China. Not to be outdone, however, the first 10 days of the year have also been very eventful in the trade war. Next week, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will be in Washington DC to sign the Phase 1 trade deal with US President Donald Trump. I'll be joined by our political economy editor Zhou Xin and US Bureau Chief Rob Delaney, who's in Hong Kong for a couple of weeks to find out what the chatter has been in Beijing and Washington. Second part of the show, the intrepid Cissy Zhou is in Taipei to cover Taiwan's elections this week. It's not even in the trade war, but some people have already declared that Taiwan is the winner. She's going to be joining us on the line to give us a flavour of how it is on the ground there. Hold on to your hats. I'm delighted to be joined today by political economy editor Zhou Xin and US Bureau Chief Rob Delaney. Rob, you're usually based in Washington, D.C. We have you in Hong Kong for a couple of weeks. You're very welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Finbarr. I'm here for my annual check-in, and it's delightful here in Hong Kong. I mean, I don't see any tear gas wafting around, and it feels like summer in New York City here. It's so warm.
Yeah, I mean, this must be the only place in the world where the new year has got off to a relatively calm start. We're obviously speaking on the Friday before what we think will be the signing of what we think we know will be the signing of the Phase 1 US-China trade war deal. Zhou Xin, this has been something which has been in the works for a long time, and yet it wasn't always 100% certain that we would get there, but it looks as though we will get there. Just give us an idea as to what is the sort of, from the Chinese side, how did we get to this point and where are they mentally at this point?
China wants to sign this deal, but China do not want to sign the deal as a weaker side. China does not want to be perceived, as giving concessions to U.S. President Donald Trump. And China certainly does not want to take any part in this reality show. And that's why China has made it very clear from the very beginning, this deal has to be signed on a balanced and equal basis. And also it is quite clear to us now that President Xi Jinping has no intention to sign this deal face-to-face with Donald Trump, despite Donald Trump's insistence that he will have a big signing ceremony. So that's why Beijing is sending Liu He instead of President Xi to Washington. And also, as we see from yesterday's press conference by the Ministry of Commerce, Vice Premier Liu will travel there just as using his normal titles, not a special ambassador for President Xi.
Special envoy or whatever.
Exactly. So from China's perspective, China wants to sign the deal so that the tariffs can be scaled back. Some tariffs can be scaled back, and there can be a stable external environment to help its weakening domestic economy. But at the same time, China doesn't want to be seen as, China's kowtowing to Donald Trump's ridiculous demands.
Yeah, and just already this year, I mean, what is it? Check my watch, it's the 10th of January. Already we've seen the mercurial nature of President Trump, because you had a story right at the beginning of 2020 saying that Liu He would travel to the United States to sign the deal. As I understand from what you've said, this was set in stone. The Chinese side had arranged this, and then Donald Trump took to Twitter to torpedo these plans by saying the deal would be signed on January 15th, which will now happen. So already we've seen in this short year so far the potential that Donald Trump has to make the Chinese side, to embarrass them or, to make life difficult for them. So it's quite, I guess, easy to understand why Xi Jinping doesn't necessarily want to spend too much time in the same room as Donald Trump.
Yes, because it is by default, if you remember clearly, I mean, after the two sides said they reached agreements on the Phase 1 deal, it is actually Rob Lighthizer, the U.S. side, USTR representative, coming out to say the deal will be signed in the first week of January. Okay, that's a default model. And Lighthizer said, when he said this, the initial arrangement is he will sign this deal with Vice Premier Liu He. These two are counterparts, proper counterparts. And this is being later confirmed even after our report was published. The first report was published. Peter Navarro was asked in a public interview, and he said, yes, it's very likely next week.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of like default arrangements. And even in terms of diplomatic arrangements, if Vice Premier Liu He is getting signed, the counterpart should be Lighthizer.
Mm-hmm.
But Trump was so, eager to have this show of himself, so he just tweeted to say, I'm going to sign this, have a big ceremony in White House, and I'm going to do it. And it raised like a new timeline. Mm-hmm. So accordingly, China has to adjust it. And for China, it's actually a good thing, right? It's Trump is almost like demote himself to sign to sign a contract with vice premier instead of president of the Chinese government.
It is unusual for a trade agreement to be signed by the so-called leader of the free world. But Rob, can you think of any reason in particular that Donald Trump would be keen for some good news right now?
Oh, where do we start? I mean, of course, the impeachment battle is raging now in Washington. But it's important to point out that Trump does not seem to be losing any of his support. He's not losing his base. If anything, it's possible that this impeachment battle could end up strengthening his position. So whereas I think a lot of people maybe a month ago were saying that it's very clear that Trump needs this deal. He needs to sign this deal because he needs a win to fight off this terrible threat to his presidency. I don't think it doesn't appear that this is the threat that people thought he was facing before. I mean, having said all that, it's clear that he wants to sign this regardless of what happens to be swirling around the White House at the moment. We all know that he is sort of the grandmaster of showmanship. He wants all the optics that he can get for the signing ceremony, so he's going ahead with it. But it's interesting that his remarks even just yesterday out of Washington, where he's giving his kind of double-barreled message. So he's saying that we want to get started right away on negotiations for phase 2. However, we may not get an agreement until after the election, which is 11 months away. So on the one hand, it's yes, let's get this done, let's get the negotiations started right away. But hey, who knows? Maybe we're going to delay this for a year. I mean, he's just it's a classic Trump strategy of let's keep all the options on the table, let's keep everyone off balance, and let's keep everyone guessing as to what's coming next, because that gives him time to make his moves based on whatever political calculation seems to be the most valid at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's something, I guess, Zhou Xin, and think back to over the last couple of years that we've been reporting on this, that calculus is something that China has really had to get used to. Do you think at this point they've sort of worked Trump out, or are they off balance? Are they sort of constantly wondering, will he, won't he,
Well, China, I think from perspective of Beijing, I think they should try to stay away from this whole like impeachment or the re-election of Trump. Say would like sit on side and see what's going on. I think it's really, really unwise if Beijing try to get involved into this or try to influence whatever, because whatever Beijing will do will be perceived so badly, and it will not help to build up the bilateral relationship, whether or not Trump will win the re-election.
What are we thinking will happen after the phase 1 deal is signed? Are they, Donald Trump has made various noises about the phase 2 negotiations. I think there may have been some mention of phase 2 in the press conference yesterday in MOFCOM, if only to acknowledge it.
Basically, they say we have no information to provide at the moment about phase 2, which says a lot.
Yeah,
which is China is not in any manner, have to be in a hurry to start phase 2 talks. And from Liao Ming, one of the key members in the negotiation team, the wording is the phase 1 deal talks will subject to the implementation of the phase 1 deal. In other words, if Beijing is happy about phase one deal result, yes, there will be phase two talks. If Beijing is not happy, forget about it.
Yeah, I think the phase two is the more difficult stuff as well. It's the structural changes to the Chinese economy, which I guess they've been keen to keep off the negotiating table. And Rob, what's the sort of expectation in the US? I mean, when I speak to contacts I have in Washington, they're very dismissive about the prospect of anything beyond a phase one, certainly this side of the election.
Yeah, that's what we hear on the ground in Washington also. There's a lot of pessimism about where it could lead because you start talking about structural reforms, and of course all of the China hands at the think tanks will say that it's nigh on impossible really for Trump or anyone in Washington to be able to push China to make actual structural changes. So it's a real question mark. No, I don't think anyone is expecting an end to this trade war in the next 2 months or 3 months.
And do you feel like this year, even more than last year, given that we're in the election year, is going to be a roller coaster in terms of the US-China relationship, regardless of whether or not they establish this phase one deal?
Absolutely. There's so much legislation that is still pending. Obviously, at the end of last year, we had the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. We've got the Xinjiang Act, which carries a lot of potential sanctions with it. That looks like it's just days away from passing, even though we've got the impeachment imbroglio kind of playing out. The word that we're getting from the offices of the key senators in Washington is that they're still going to manage to the bill's currently in conference. Both chambers have passed it. They just need to come together to do final wording, and it looks like that's going to be passed. And then behind that, there's a whole lot of other legislation dealing with things, dealing with Taiwan, dealing with the South China Sea. So it's all very contentious, and it's all going to continue playing out this year.
So for the phase two deal, I think I need to make one more point, is that we can think it this way. Okay, the talks collapsed in April or May because the US and China cannot agree some key parts. And when they decided to restart the negotiation, they decided okay, let's put what we can agree upon into the phase one. And what we disagree, we push it to phase two. And these basically, the clauses or the terms in the phase two are already Beijing said no, or said we cannot agree upon. So what will promote anyone to think that Beijing will change its mind just a few months later?
I think most people's expectations are fairly well managed on that one. In some ways, it seems a little bit crazy to be talking about the progress in the US-China relationship, about this phase one deal as being progress, while simultaneously you have so much of the legislation that Rob just mentioned, but also you've got this massive tech war going on as well, where the US is trying to restrict China's access to American technology and is also trying to restrict Chinese technology from entering the United States. Zhou Xin, is this something that policymakers in Beijing are worried about? Like when you speak with people in the capital, what's the sense of the tech war running alongside the trade war?
Well, I think it's quite widely agreed in Beijing that the strategic rivalry between China and the United States will continue. And trade war, tech war, financial war, whatever, is just, the symptoms of this fundamental rivalry between the two great powers. So even China and the US can sign the phase one deal. I think it's quite clear in Beijing that, the competition or the troubles on other fronts will not cease, notably on the technology side. But that said, from China's perspective, yes, we're going to have rainy days day after day for the China-US relationship. But if we can sign the phase one deal and buy time for maybe 2 hours of sunshine, let's enjoy the 2 hours of sunshine.
I like your optimism. Rob, what's your sense of how that's viewed in Washington?
I would say that it looks like we will get this phase one deal, and so that is, if anything, that's going to embolden the lawmakers and policymakers who have a very anti-China stance to take more of a stance on this issue, on the exports of sensitive technologies to China and the importation of 5G telecom equipment to the U.S. I think they'll cede ground on the trade front, and I think in exchange for that, they are going to beat the drum louder on the risks that the U.S. faces from Chinese technology.
Yeah. And how like when, I guess it's impossible to give a ratio or a percentage, but in terms of your sense of just how many lawmakers would you include in that anti-China? Is it a significant proportion of U.S. lawmakers?
I mean, I would say when we're kind of scrambling to get comments, there's a group of about 5 senators that come to mind immediately. Of course, Marco Rubio. There's also Josh Hawley. There's Rick Scott, and there's a handful of others that really stand out, and they're very vocal and they have a lot of power on this issue.
Great stuff. Okay, guys, thanks so much for your time. We look forward to seeing what happens next week. She just sent me some rolly eye emoji. Cissy Zhou joins us on the line from Taipei, where she is covering the Taiwanese elections, which are happening this Saturday. Cissy, what's the mood on the ground like in Taipei this week?
In Taipei this week, you will find that every people is talking about the election. Whenever you go to a restaurant or you are walking in the street, like everybody next to you, they're just talking about election. No matter they are young or old, and even if you're in a taxi, you will see like the taxi driver, he's watching TV because he has a small screen in the taxi, and everything is about election here.
So it sounds very exciting. What exactly have you been doing over the last day or two?
So I went to Han Kuo-yu's final campaign rally last night, and there's gonna be another one for Tsai Ing-wen tonight.
So these are just to for those who aren't familiar with Han is the challenger and Tsai is the incumbent, the president of Taiwan.
And Han was regarded as because he is from KMT, which is a pro-China party,
it's certainly,
and Han Kuo-yu was regarded as a top choice by China. But Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, he is pro-independence, and she is the favorite candidate of the U.S.
Yes. So what was the mood like at the Han rally last night? Was it full of political campaigners? Was it very lively?
It was crazy. The official number of the rally is 1 million, but my estimate, but I think it's like it should be less than 500,000. Anyway, there are crowds of people, and it's very difficult for people trying to get close to the stage. So, and something very interesting at the rally is that if you look at the crowds, you will see like almost all his supporters are senior citizens, like at least aged above 45. And I was trying to find 2 or 3 of his young supporters, but it was very difficult. But finally, I found 2. Yeah. And then they flew back from Shanghai to vote for him. Those 2 Taiwanese girls, they just started to work in China 2 months ago. But they support Han Kuo-yu.
Very interesting. So the older crowd is going with the more pro-Beijing candidate. And I just want to assure any listeners who think that Cissy is stigmatizing the over 45s. We don't consider over 45 to be senior citizens.
Something I was quite surprised is that because previously people always say that KMT is very pro-China. So I assume that Han's supporters, they are pro-China too, right? So I talked to the old fans and also talked to some his young fans, and I find it's quite shocking. Like none of his supporters are pro-China.
Okay.
And some of them even said that they want Taiwan to be an independent country. So I asked them, I said that it's quite interesting that why do you still support Han Kuo-yu, because he's regarded as a pro-China political figure. And then they said, oh, no, we regard us as Taiwanese. We never think that we are Chinese people, and we don't want a reunification. We think Taiwan is Taiwan, China is China, and we don't want a war between Taiwan and China.
So the sense is that rather than pursuing, integration with mainland China, these people are wanting perhaps a more friendly relationship with China because they're afraid of a war.
Yes, exactly. So to be accurate, I think they are supporters of ROC, the Republic of China. That's what they call Taiwan.
Yeah. Cissy, we've had you on the podcast before talk about your trips to Vietnam, and you've been reporting there on the manufacturers leaving China and travelling to Southeast Asia to set up there. Are you seeing the same sort of trend with these manufacturers coming from China to Taiwan, or is the situation in any way different?
To some extent, to be accurate, because those all those relocations, they are part of their global footprint. For example, like Foxconn, they are also investing in Taiwan, but that doesn't mean that they are investing everything in Taiwan. They still have footprint in mainland China, and then they have manufacturing bases in Southeast Asia and a lot of countries. So, which means that whenever there's a crisis, global economic crisis occur, and those manufacturers, they can adjust the production lines globally in a timely manner.
Yeah. And we're going to hear more from you in detail when you return to Hong Kong. We'll have you come into the studio and tell us about your trip. But do you get the sense that this economic policy of bringing companies back from China to Taiwan is important in the election? Or, when you discuss people, is it something that they're aware of and that they feel is a good thing?
Yes, it is actually, because Tsai's government, Tsai Ing-wen, the current president, her government introduced those policies to bring Taiwanese manufacturing back home, and they are claiming a big trump of those policies. They are saying, "See, we are seeing manufacturing are coming back one after another." So on social media, the DPP is claiming their victory of bringing Taiwanese manufacturing back from China, which will boost Taiwan's economy. But the KMT, the opposition party, they are quite skeptical about Tsai's policies. And one big major argument the KMT was having is that because they argued that for those investment back to Taiwan, most of them will come from local loans from Taiwanese banks. Which is not the cash, which is not the same as those manufacturers bring cash back to Taiwan, which is different.
Okay, well, Cissy, the election is happening on Saturday. We're going to have you back in Hong Kong next week. We look forward to hearing what you have seen and heard. Have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our first episode of 2020. It's going to be a big week next week when Liu He visits Washington to sign the Phase 1 trade deal. And as you've heard from Rob and Zhou Xin today, it's not so much a ceasefire, but the end of Act 1 and the beginning of Act 2 in this ongoing multi-billion-dollar drama. There really is much more to come in this trade war, not least how it plays into the US presidential election. Now, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate us, give us a review on whatever platform you're listening on right now. And if you're on Twitter, don't forget you can follow the SCMP trade team on @SCMP Economy. And if you really want to find me, I'm at F Birmingham. And that's FBER Birmingham, not like the city. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
You've been listening to the US-China Trade War Update, presented by Finbarr Bermingham. If you want to take a deep dive into the stories of people affected by the trade war, search for Behind the Tariffs, a 7-part series taking you from Chicago to Shanghai, Hong Kong to Ho Chi Minh City to meet the business people dealing with tariffs coming from both the US and China. Behind the Tariffs, available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. Another podcast from the South China Morning Post.